Oh, yeah, it's time to get experience. Welcome on in. Brian Campbell coming at you. Thank you for patronizing this here YouTube channel. And this week's top five, let's have some fun here. We all watch UFC fights. We all watch from the pay-per-views to the fight nights. Some of us, like Luke Thomas, turn down the volume, right? And just watch it ourselves. But ultimately, a broadcaster, and in this case in the UFC, they've got a two-tone job, if you will. They've got to educate and they've got to entertain, which I certainly think the latter, the much more important up to this point. As a growing broadcaster myself in the boxing space, I certainly understand and respect the challenges that go into this job, what it takes to sort of try to make your mark and carve it out. But at the end of the day, I'm just a fan like everybody else. I've got my favorites. So this is my top five working pound for pound list at the moment of the best broadcasters in the UFC today. Hope you enjoy. Comment down below if you disagree, of course, but buckle up, get ready, right in your face hole with another direct dose of that performance enhancing audio like only your boy BC can. Let's hit it right now. Number five, look, this is a name that when he first made the transition from ex-fighter to analyst to TV broadcaster, I wasn't so sure. He wasn't offensive, but he was new, he was fresh, he was green. But I think Paul Felder has made a very quick transition to becoming one of the elite analysts in this game today. You may hear him a lot on the fight night. Love the chemistry that he brings when paired with someone like Brendan Fitzgerald. But even when Paul Felder's been called up to the major league level in the UFC, he seems to always deliver. Look, he's an ex-fighter with a very respectable background. So what he brings to the table analysis-wise is always believable. He's recent enough to the fight game where he can talk about having trained or maybe still training in a lot of ways with the fighters that we see today. So that's valuable insight. And maybe he's always seemed to be flirting with the idea of coming back with a fight for himself, or at least staying in shape and keeping in the drug testing pool. But Paul's ultimately, his transition, I think, was built upon the charisma. He's very likable. He's very relatable. He does have that third guy at the end of the bar when you're watching the fights feel. Obviously, he's more than that because he brings the fighting background. But I think his greatest strength is being just a balanced, easy to listen to, and seemingly from a chemistry standpoint, it seems to be easy to work with. Doesn't overstay his welcome when he jumps in, maybe like a Bisping who can be very wordy and can speak too much. What he does say has value. I think he rises to the occasion when he needs to in the good moments. And I think overall, Paul Felder just brings smarts, just brings energy, just brings a smoothness to this game that he's pretty much a well-rounded package. And I'd like to see him continue to get big-time opportunities to become a pay-per-view level fixture. Right now, we seem to have that A-team set in stone where it's Jon Anik, it's Daniel Cormier, it is Joe Rogan, and a lot of times you get Megan O'Leary as the reporter. I do like, though, when we rotate some of those other names in there, and I like when Paul Felder gets those swings because I think ultimately he delivers at the end of the day. Not an easy job to do. These guys have to call long prelim cards before they even get to the pay-per-view portion. On the pay-per-view cards, you can have 3 sections of those cards. You can be calling up to 15 fights, it seems. Here's a guy who seems to deliver at an even keel from start to finish. Paul Felder really coming on in my eyes as one of the more likable voices in the space today. Number 4, I'm going to go with somebody who Luke Thomas has championed very early on. At times I thought too early, but when I tuned in and finally took notice of what Laura Senko is bringing to the table right now, he's right. She's one of the top broadcasters already in this game today, which I think makes a lot of sense at her very almost overnight meteoric rise. The hard work is there. You see the work she does in the Dana White Contender Series, a vehicle that in a lot of ways she's taken over and made her own. But even when she gets these historic crossover opportunities to reach the pay-per-view level, which she did, and gets the opportunities that she's had, Laura Senko always delivers. And for somebody who can bring respectability because she had been a pro fighter, does have that one pro fight, is a regular in gyms, can speak to that aspect. She has to overcome the fact that she doesn't have success in that area on the same level as a Daniel Cormier, who is a 2-time Olympian, a 2-division champion, probably one of the 7 greatest fighters in the history of the sport. But I think she fills whatever she lacks perfectly because she brings smartness, she brings confidence, but she has some of the better mechanics that we see from broadcasters in this game today. And sometimes as a fan, you don't care about that, or maybe you don't notice it or how to notice it. But from somebody myself who is in broadcasting, it's not always easy to present natural chemistry when you're working with different partners coming in. Sometimes egos get in the way, sometimes different things. Laura Senko is really good at playing her role in the chemistry, never overstaying her welcome when it comes to delivering the analysis, making sure the analysis has substance, being likable, of course, in many ways, has a great personality. But I'm overly impressed with how strong her chops are and how quickly she's been able to not just rise, but raise her game to each opportunity when she gets the chances at the bigger fight night cards or even on the pay-per-view level, which we've seen her before. Just listen in and see. There's not a point which, there's some good broadcasters in the UFC who have big names, but maybe they aren't great broadcasters yet. You can still hear and witness and experience a lot of the flaws that they still bring or the times that they can hold up a broadcast. Laura Senko's traffic, her awareness is very strong in that regard. Gets in, gets out, elevates the broadcast along the way. That's what you have to look for in a very good broadcaster, and she's on her way to becoming a great one. My number 3 choice in my personal pound-for-pound list of UFC broadcasters, I say this is a controversial one because I see this man getting a lot of hate, but for my money, Dominick Cruz, the curmudgeon all-time great bantamweight champion, and I say curmudgeon in a good way from this standpoint, to me is the best fight pure analyst in the UFC today. Some people don't like that. Some people don't like his style. They think his personality is stale, but I think Dominick Cruz shines when paired on the pay-per-view level with Jon Anik and Daniel Cormier because of that sort of that hard shell. Look, he's always been an overly confident fighter who, with the injury history he has had, to be able to persevere the way he has, the inspirational speeches he's given through the years. Think on Ariel Helwani's MMA Hour. Some of those speeches makes me want to, run through a building and tackle all of my, career aspirations. This guy is a hard worker, and I saw that on full display when he initially made the transition into broadcasting. I remember being in New York City at Media Day for a UFC Madison Square Garden card. I think it was UFC 230, but I could be wrong. It was the Daniel Cormier against Derek Lewis fight card. And I remember taking notice back when pre-pandemic, when UFC was still doing the media days with each fighter set up, right, with the sign of their name, and you sort of get in that media line to listen in, to ask questions, maybe to do your interview on camera. Dom was a student of the game with his notebook, jumping right in, not looking to be the celebrity reporter there, but looking to do hard work, gain the nuggets that he needed for the broadcast. I think the fact that he is sort of that ex-fighter who still kind of has this defensive posture and aura to him, it works so well, whether he's arguing in a comedic way with DC or even Anik. Those two have always seemed to have very good on-air chemistry. We saw in the UFC Fun and Games weigh-in show that they did for 305 where Anik was calling out Dominick Cruz's, Mr. Rogers sweater. They seem to have a good back and forth there. But I think Dom explains his analysis very well. He's got a very high-level knowledge of the game. He had such a unique style as a fighter. But here's a guy who can really specifically speak to the mindset and the ability to overcome, the ability to persevere. I think that dry persona at times is the perfect complement to the over-exorbitant, charismatic Daniel Cormier, for example, when they're paired together, or really anybody else. Dom Cruz speaks to me in a lot of ways as a viewer when I'm listening. I feel like I learn more when he's speaking. And it may not be everybody's favorite, but I like how unique he is. He doesn't seem to care what people think about him. I mean, I mentioned that curmudgeonry. Remember when the whole Keith Peterson smells like booze and hooch thing came out? I mean, he'll speak his mind. He'll speak his mind on the broadcast when bringing up referees he's had issues with in the past. I like that he's still got that edge to him, still in a lot of ways, and I think it only fuels and informs his broadcasting ability even more. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Like, there's roles in the broadcasting game, not just the roles of like play-by-play guy, ex-fighter analyst. Sometimes you'll get the role I fill in boxing a lot of times is that third member of the team, that second analyst who's that mixture of, reporter. Yeah, I know the fight game, but it's sort of bringing that other area. You got to know your role within that in a lot of ways. And I think Dom Cruz knows his role well, and I think he plays it in a very unique way because chemistry isn't automatic when these teams get together. And I love that he doesn't change who he is, but he doesn't overstay his welcome. You don't hear him speaking too much. He is willing to play the heel or villain if that's what takes place at that time. I think sometimes people miscast themselves. Bisping, I think, is a great example. Somebody who's a very good character, especially in a podcast sense, or especially when he was a fighter in an interview sense, but is so much better when he's playing his natural persona, which to me is sort of this fun heel in a lot of ways. I think Bisping's problem of late in broadcasting. He's trying to clean up that heel persona too much and be very likable, very much apologetic when he's criticizing people. Not Dom Cruz. He knows the job. He knows his role in there, and he absolutely brings it. And if I was picking my, dream A team for every pay-per-view, without disrespect to Joe Rogan, I would go Anik, DC, and the second DC, Dominick Cruz. Number 2 on BC's personal top 5 pound-for-pound UFC broadcasting list. I don't think it's polarizing to say this. Daniel Cormier is arguably the best personality in this entire sport. And I think what he brings specifically to that very important, charismatic color analyst role. If we're doing a 3-man team, which UFC mostly does, not counting the sideline reporter in their pay-per-view levels, at least one of those two needs to have that personality, needs to be so likable. There's nobody more likable in UFC broadcasting than Daniel Cormier. And I say that too about his run as a fighter, which is weird because in that great rivalry he had with Jon Jones, which seems to still kind of be ongoing in a lot of ways, he was wrongfully maligned and a lot of times as a heel in that. It really took Jon's drug test issues and the subsequent escalation of his outside the cage issues for us to realize, no, DC was the hero in this story all along. DC's lovable. He was the best interview in my years, which is at the highest level, on a national level. I'm entering my 15th year covering boxing and mixed martial arts. Daniel Cormier was always my favorite interview because he was so honest of his shortcomings, of his missteps, of everything. And I think you mix that honesty with the fact that he's that huggable teddy bear, and he's so charismatic. His laugh is infectious. He can hit the big moment. I mean, think Thug Rose. He can give you that iconic call. I think sometimes the Anik, Rogan, DC team, which you could argue is their premier team and argue is their best team at times, I think sometimes the combination of the personalities of Rogan and DC can get too comical and robust. Sometimes it can feel too much like a frat party in a lot of ways, or like a watch-along party, a live companion rather than a live broadcast. Personally, why I think Dominick Cruz rubs perfectly against Daniel Cormier when they're paired together, because they're so opposite. But whether it's Rogan, whether it's whoever there, Daniel Cormier knows his role. I don't think he goes beyond the bounds of his role. He can be too much, I guess, at times for some people. I think some people maybe will argue that his analysis isn't as deep as others. Obviously, he knows the wrestling game. We remember that very public sort of fun but serious beef that Dominick Cruz had for DC as a broadcaster, kind of calling him out publicly and saying he needs to watch more tape. I don't know if that's rooted in a rivalry between them, or maybe comments DC had made about Cruz while he was still a fighter. But I liked it. I liked that it challenged DC. But, I don't look at DC necessarily, even though I like his analysis, as being that role of the teacher and the educator. Sometimes I like if you're going to have 2 analysts mixed with a play-by-play guy. And I don't mind if those 2 are 2 ex-fighters, or 1 ex-fighter and a coach, or 1, in the role I fill in boxing, 1 ex-fighter and 1 journalist who can sort of, kind of bridge the gap of all the roles in one and fill in the blanks, which is a lot of times I find that's what the role I do best. I think Daniel Cormier hits the right notes, makes me laugh, entertains me, knows how to dial it up, has enough, obviously, of one of the more decorated resumes in the history of the sport, where what he says has value to it. Will he get a little bit too excited and call a submission before it's actually happened, like Rogan in the second half of his career can do? Oh, that's in, I think it's over, and it's not even in at all. It can happen to them in the moment, in the flow. But I do always remember one thing when we're looking to critique UFC announcers that I think they deserve a little bit of grace, and it's what I mentioned earlier. The amount of fights that they're covering, the amount of time that they are in that booth without much of a break. Because if we're honest, for the most part, especially on the pay-per-view level, UFC paces these cards very well. You won't get an obnoxious amount of fight features. Now, the fight nights can be a different story, especially when we've got 6 fight main cards on the fight nights, and especially maybe when the main event isn't worthy of having 3 or 4 features being shown of a Spivak versus Tybura rematch. Another argument for another day. But DC, to me, is the TV-friendly star of stars. I don't know if he's really found his outside the cage perfect vehicle yet. He's doing good work on his YouTube channel. I know he had the show with Ryan Clark, had the show with Ariel before that, now has the sort of crossover show with Chael Sonnen, which can certainly have moments of sort of like fun, raw, real honesty in there. but I don't even think DC has touched the potential of what he can be. Is he Michael Strahan who can go do like the Today Show? It's possible. I think DC's that lovable. He's that knowledgeable. And I think he is the rightful heart and soul in a lot of ways of the UFC Elite pay-per-view broadcast at number 2. So who's number 1? Hey, he's the voice of the UFC. And I know you're going to say, oh, he's your boy, BC, so of course he's number 1. Part is true. But he also deserves it. Jon Anik is the greatest play-by-play voice for my money in MMA history. I think he's the greatest UFC has ever had. And I think when it's all said and done, he's going to be in that upper pantheon in combat sports with names like Jim Lampley, like Mauro Ranallo. Jon Anik, he had an adjustment period. And, I was happy and lucky enough to have been a friend and been a coworker with him at ESPN and watched his initial rise, watched him arrive on the scene at ESPN as a part-time radio guy who would drive down to Connecticut from Boston and was a boxing guy and had a boxing radio show that took him to so many fights, and MMA was new. And I think his quick transition with the MMA Live vehicle on ESPN, which had such a early monumental role in raising the profile of MMA and the UFC on a much more national sort of mainstream level through ESPN. And look where we are now, all of these years later. Jon evolved quickly. And I know he's been a guy who looks back at his early tapes as cringe. And you can certainly listen to the early shows he did with, especially with Kenny Florian, where he was a little bit raw. But Jon Anik takes this craft as serious or more than anyone I've ever met. He's got a Mauro Ranallo level work ethic, which is saying a lot. That's a huge compliment. And I got to see from the beginning how Jon was able to sort of craft the broadcaster he became. I remember sitting next to him at ESPN when he got the call to fill in and call an international boxing broadcast. I think it was a Vitaly Klitschko heavyweight title defense, if I recall. And I watched him develop his system of fighter note cards that he still uses today. I run into Jon Anik at fights in the casino or the restaurant, but it's never like, hey, we're old buds, let's go hang out and paint the town red together. It's always in passing, because I always say to him, man, I never see you around out here. Why is that? I never see you on Fight Week out at the bar or whatever. He goes, and this is the thing that always lingers in my head in my broadcasting career. He says, look, BC, it's an open book test. I have X amount of hours from now for when that fight card starts. And to him, the value in putting in the time is worth it, because you can hear who he has become now. In a lot of ways, a flawless executioner of what is one of the hardest jobs in broadcasting, to do that many fights, to be that boisterous, to keep that energy that high across the board. I mean, by the time that Jon Anik does that Dateline sort of, his patented call, and he's got the camera on him, and that's, couple hours into the broadcast, he may have already called 5, 10, 11 fights up to that point, and he still brings it. I saw a lot of that process of how it was made, and I think Jon has found this perfect balance with figuring out his voice, figuring out how to be as efficient as possible, especially when paired with very verbose people. And I think the most verbose combination you can have is like a DC with Bisping or a DC with Rogan, where sometimes it's even hard for Jon to get in and out. But he's got to do the old school things that Goldie had to do, where on the fly, you've got to deliver those commercials, those ad reads, and he knows how to get in and out. But what is the biggest thing that I always look for in a play-by-play announcer? And this is the first play-by-play announcer on my list. The rest are fight analysts. Whether it's boxing or MMA, I will forgive your shortcomings if you can do what I think is the most important, and that's deliver the big moment. That's to going 0 to 60. In boxing, it's obviously when there's a knockdown. In MMA and UFC, it can be, knockdowns certainly happen. It can be any big swing of momentum. Think Mauro Ranallo, who is incredible at that. I think Todd Grisham, a guy who is, I think, underrated in a lot of ways, who has always been able to deliver that big moment. Jon Anik delivers that big moment as good as anybody. He's got the catchphrases that become iconic. The call on the Leon Edwards rematch with Kamaru Usman will live forever, and Jon's got a few of those. But I don't think he's somebody who goes out of his way to pre-plan those or to try to make those. And I think that's what keeps him in his lane. I think sometimes he's very below the radar, even though he's the voice of the UFC, because he doesn't overly do things to bring extra attention to himself. But yet, in the past year, I have to say this, the more we've seen Jon Anik's twin brother, Jason, sort of become a personality that's crossing over into this space, I think it's bringing out more of who Jon Anik really is. And he's more raw than people realize. This is a guy who was early on the sports betting train. And certainly that's a big passion in his life. And I know he's got an outlet of podcasting with his brother with that. But this is a guy who lives this and cares about this. And, I talked to before, watches, especially with his brother, watches the tape of every single broadcast he does to pick out the areas that were too verbose or need to go, or the catchphrases that aren't working. This is a true studied craftsman of his game. And I think that it's one of those fine wine legacies that it may take a few more years where everyone's on board and they just go, you know what? This guy is historically the voice of an era, of a great era. Now, Goldie, Mike Goldberg, hit or miss for a lot of people. Miss a lot for me. I do respect the certain elements that he brought, and certainly Goldie's run covered so many great fights. But Jon took that baton when it was time. And I think he's almost made you forget about Goldie in a lot of ways. And that's very hard to do when you had somebody who was there for so many iconic moments. Well, look at the moments Jon Anik has had now since then. He is the voice. He is the guy. I think he works well with basically everybody. And, what I love is the respect he has for one of his early partners in Brian Stann, and the Room Service Diaries that Luke Thomas and I did, the RSD with Jon Anik that we filmed in South Florida a couple summers ago. I love the respect that he gave to Brian Stann as sort of the guy that left him, right? Brian Stann got out of the UFC game, out of the broadcasting game, really when he was at the peak of his powers. I mean, for all we know, Brian Stann could be on this pay-per-view 18 today, but he isn't. I love the respect that Jon Anik shows for how much he grew working with him. And I think that even though Jon is often paired with, historically in a lot of people's minds with Kenny Florian, and they still have the Anik Florian podcast, congrats on their long-term success. I think Stan was that long-term partner that made him better, that helped him get to the level where he did his best work. And for as good as people can be as broadcasters, you need the chemistry around you to raise your game. And I think in a lot of ways that happened with Jon. And I think Jon has done a lot to raise the game of the names around him that they're brought in with him. So much respect out to J.A. I'd love to see him do boxing again one day. I really would. I know he's flirted in the past with college football, and I think he has a very pro sports voice that can really adapt to any area he would want to go. But big shout out to J.A., the voice of an era, and a guy who's still absolutely in the peak of his prime. Those are my top 5. I do want to hit a couple honorable mentions, and one of those is Joe Rogan. And I'll say this about Rogan. I'm not a hater. I mean, the guy's really short. We got to be really honest about that. But that's neither here nor there. He still brings his strengths, I believe, are twofold still at a very elite level. One, the interviewing. I want him. I don't know if he's the best in-cage interviewer that the UFC has, but I want him in there after the biggest fights happen, and he still delivers. He's obviously, his podcast is enormously successful. That is his key strength, those interviewing skills. But I think also when you mix that with, he brings a level of gravity, of class, of prestige to the broadcast. If it's when it's an in-between UFC pay-per-view, I'm fine with anybody. But when it really is the big ticket, the big ones, the historic ones, the majors, if you will, you still get that rush when you hear Joe Rogan's voice on there. And is he in the second half? Is he not? Maybe in some ways closer to the twilight of his broadcasting career than he's not. I mean, it feels like that. I mean, what is he, in his 50s? For all we know, he could be doing this forever. I don't think he's as sharp as he once was. I don't think his connection to the actual fighting and the evolution of the game is as strong as it once was. That was once the calling card, which allowed him to transition from comedian into the early, almost pre-Zuffa days in a lot of ways of joining this UFC fold, because he had that background in Taekwondo and that passion for being somebody who was in entertainment but was also in the gyms. That's not as profound nowadays in so many ways. And, Joe will miscall things, or like I said, call us, I think that submission's close. And then you're like watching at home, you go, look, the thing's not even under the chin. But Joe brings a gravity, especially in the pre-fight video packages, especially in when the pay-per-view opens and Jon's, Dateline opening leads to him interviewing Rogan in DC. Rogan still raises the bar in that regard. He still has the fastball when it's time. I just like the more limited schedule he's been doing of late, and I think that it's fair to say he's past his prime, but he can still absolutely bring it in the moment. I want to shout out Megan O'Leary too. that's sort of the forgotten, sometimes fourth member of these broadcasts, the sideline reporter. And in the UFC's case, the sideline reporter doesn't also do the in-ring interviewers like you see a lot in boxing teams, and a job I've really, really enjoyed the times I've done it on a high level, Showtime, pay-per-view, and a few other places. Olivi's role is just sideline reporter, but she does a lot of different sequences, the walk and talks into the arena, the stand-ups outside the cage, what have you. I think she's a great job also anchoring the desk when she gets the chance. But I think Megan Olivi I talked earlier about Laura Senko's mechanics being really a big part of why she was able to make such a quick leap and be not just acceptable, but really add right away to the broadcast. Olivi's, in her own right, her technical mechanics as a broadcaster are top notch, absolutely top notch. Studied. She has a confidence to her that almost borderlines on cocky, but you can tell it's a passion for the craft that she brings. Very professional, can elevate a situation, can certainly do a fun interview backstage and show a personality. But I love it in the big fights when she's going to come out, share a nugget of a fighter's background. They do that little trope on ESPN pay-per-views where she's standing there at the tunnel as the fighter's walking by, which is kind of cool. I think she really brings top level ambition, work ethic, and skills to that. I don't know her very well outside of the job, but I have a lot of respect for the game she brings. And I also want to shout out Brendan Fitzpatrick. He sort of falls in there along with John Gooden as sort of the, B-team play-by-play guy. You'll hear him a lot on the fight nights or maybe some of the international shows. But Fitz Magic, do we call him that, or is that not his nickname? He's just good. And the thing I'll say about him, he's easy to listen to. He's easy to like. I don't know him personally, but I got a lot of respect for him. I think the best thing that he does is he knows his strengths. I think he knows his limitations even more, right? I mean, he's a play-by-play guy, not an ex-fighter, which is the typical spot. But I don't think he overstays his welcome. I think he elevates, especially when he's paired with a lot of these ex-fighters turned broadcasters who have such little experience compared to the DCs or the higher level guys. I think he's able to elevate them in ways that you don't always realize listening to the broadcast. But I know it from working. I know how hard it can be chemistry-wise when you have somebody who's not maybe up to speed next to you. I think Fitz does a great job of making that a very easy broadcast to listen to when he's the point guard, setting others up, certainly does his homework, has a knowledge of the game, but he's just likable, can rise to the moment, which he's got to be able to do, or I wouldn't put him, as an honorable mention on this list, but he can hit the big moment. I think he's a little underrated on that. But I think he's somebody who's growing, and if he ever got the call at the highest level, I think he'd be ready, and I don't think it would be a step down. You know what I'm saying? I think he can bring it on that level. So not an easy job to across the board to do, but these people do it very well. Those are my top 5 UFC pound-for-pound broadcasting list of the moment. Hope you enjoyed it. Full respect to everybody on the list, as well as those I didn't mention. I love this game of broadcasting. My forte is more on the boxing side, but there's no greater drug in this game than to be ringside, cage side, to be able to have that opportunity to add your voice to the soundtrack of what these fight nights are, these great nights in these athletes' lives. So much respect for how that job is done. I don't always get it right. I can be very verbose. I can do, which is sometimes the hardest to do, where you know the timing. You have the timing of when to jump in, but then you jump in and suddenly you're like, I don't know how to get out of this sentence, and you can be caught off the exit wandering verbally and be too verbose. But it's a skill that the only way it really can be developed and crafted over time is the reps and putting in the work. I think it's very rare when you see someone like a Paulie Malignaggi, when he arrived on the scene at Showtime right at the end of his fighting career, was just a natural from day one, who not only seemed to get the flow of it, but just seemed to have at that time, a very unique element to the analysis he brings. It's very rare that somebody can do that. DC transition very quick. He was one of those names, but I couldn't respect more the what it takes to do this job, especially with the UFC and the amount of fights that they have to call. So full respect out to everybody. Please like and subscribe this video if you enjoy when Campbell rambles, and we'll continue to build this fun little thing here. It's a little break. It's a little bit filler, but hopefully it was just as killer to you. Your boy BC signing off. Hope you're well. Keep it smart. Keep it safe. Keep it strong up here. You got this. All right. We out.